Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to a very, very special night on the Oak Barrel Whiskey calendar. My year revolves around this date. I don't, worry about birthdays or New Year's Eve or Christmas, because this being the Friday, the last Friday in August, leading into the last weekend of August, is generally the start of Sydney Whisky Fair. And right now at 7 o'clock, we'd be 2 hours into our first session. I'd be a little bit panicked and running around and making sure everything's going all right and putting out fires left, right, and centre. Thankfully, I'm not. Well, thankfully for me, I'm not. But we can't do Whisky Fair, obviously. So we are actually marking it. There's a bit of duality here with the finale of Sydney Whisky Forum, our final showcase and panel and discussion after 2 weeks of venturing whiskey all around Australia and all around the world. My name is Scott Fitzsimons. I look after all the whiskey, including Sydney Whisky Fair, here at the Oak Barrel, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to something very, very special, and a whiskey that, for me at least, has been about 7 years in the making. We've announced it a couple of hours ago that we have a very, very special double cask release that Sullivans Cove and Heather in particular has sort of worked on to have a little bit of fun with. And tonight we have a very, very special guest, for me, one of the great noses and whiskey producers and whiskey anythings in the Australian industry, Heather Tillott from the Sullivans Cove Distillery. And if you are watching this back in the future, yes, it is true, Sydney is in lockdown at the moment, and you can tell that by the haircut difference. In lockdown, no one open, not in lockdown. And that you can see a very, very stark example of what's going on. But Heather, mates, how are you? And thank you so much for joining us on this Friday night.
It's a pleasure. And I feel pretty dirty that I've been to the barber today. But yeah. Welcome. Well, yes. And it's lovely to be with everybody in lounge rooms across the country.
Yeah, we've sent packs for this all over the country for nights, but obviously they were quite limited. So even if you didn't get a pack, feel free to crack something you've got at home and join in the chat and have a little bit of a chat. And I want to say g'day to everyone in the chat that's pulling through. Everyone from Fred Siggins to Gary. And thank you, Gary. I just in time got your delivery of brownies here sitting next to me just off screen, so that's great. And Dan Mathers as well, tuning in from Queensland. So, Heather, we were just having a little bit of a chat before we went live here, and this is going to be an excellent discussion if that's anything to go by. But tonight we want to celebrate double cask and the art of blending and what that means. And when I say blending, I still mean single malt, but within a distillery, getting casks together to create sums, things that are bigger than the sums of their parts. So before we dive in, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and sort of, your title is Distillery Manager, but sometimes the word manager can mean that you sit in an office and let other people do things, when that's certainly not the case with what you do for Sullivans. Just how long you've been at Sullivans and what your day-to-day is looking like at the moment.
So I've been with Sullivans since the beginning of 2016. So I started just, doing the basics of distilling, doing a bit of cellar door stuff, just like most people at Sullivans Cove out the back start off. Sorry, I can just see Samuel commenting on my hair in there. So yeah, I've been here for going on 6 years. I've done a bit of everything in the company, but predominantly distilling. And the company, we've gone through a lot of change and growth in that period. So somehow got myself in the top job in production, which I never would have thought would have happened, to be honest, at all. I moved to Tassie with the intention of doing winemaking, and so this is kind of fortuitously just happened. But yeah, day to day, my role is Distillery Manager. So there's a lot of managing sort of stuff that goes along with that. There is a lot of sitting at a computer and doing spreadsheets and, the strategy behind production and all those kind of things, ordering barrels, making sure quality is tip top, looking at a lot of process and procedure. And I guess you could say my role kind of, sets the parameter for all the aspects of production and what goes on. I still get down on the still as well sometimes, and it's really great. We've got a wonderful crew of distillers and production staff that Yeah, I love them all very much. We're a really ace team, and everyone's super committed to producing just delicious liquid. That's what we're all about. And we all feel it. I mean, I certainly believe it that like any crafted product, the fingerprint of the people who make it and the countenance of the people who make it really comes through. And I like to think that a lot of the that kind of gentle intensity that comes with the Sullivan spirit is a reflection of the people that make it as well. But yeah, do all of the blending work, and I like you noted that, like, we're talking about blends here. It's not a technical blend; it's all single malt, but it is the act of blending things that creates these products. So we loosely just use the term blend, or Heather's on a blending day, or whatever, something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of that goes on, and smelling things, that's an everyday thing. Smelling, tasting spirits of coming off the still to, however many decades old. And yeah, it's a job that smells good.
Yeah. Well, we're having a bit of a chat with Bill Lark and Tim Duckett on Wednesday on one of these panels, and we've come up with a theme for one of our events next year, which is going to be called Sniffing Butts. BUTTS for some sherry cups, maybe in collaboration with Youngie. But yes, Bill did tell me off for using the word blend too vigorously in a few cases. So we're all talking about single malts, but I mean, for me, and there's been a lot of talk this week, organically from distillers in Australia and even from distillers and blenders in the US that we spoke to in the first week about, single casks are great. When you find that one cracking single cask, it's awesome, and it's life affirming, and it's great, particularly for distillers. I am doing something right, that sort of thing. But there's this sort of thought, if you can create a really great blend of a few casks or vatting of a few casks, then that can be more complex than anything that you can find in a single cask. And I'm often the art of vatting and blending, particularly in Scotland, the top master blenders who are making Glenlivet 12 or Lefroy 10 year in, year out, they're the celebrator ones. But that's all about consistency. And not necessarily just creating the best thing that you can create. So, I mean, for me, the double cask has been the standout in the Sullivan's range for the past, 2 or 3 years. How does it sit for you guys in terms of, how you feel about it as trying to pick favourites between all your babies?
Yeah, it is a bit like trying to pick your favourite baby. Look, we describe ourselves often as a single cask focused distillery, which we are. Like the majority of our releases you see on the EDMs and all the rest of it are single cask. It might be American Oak ex-bourbon, however many years old, first fill, all the rest, Tawny, Apera, Muscat. And single casks are a feat of nature, right? I mean, you work so hard to get every part of the process, and so many people are inputting over years and years and years. There's a plethora of people inputting and leaving their fingerprints on any barrel, particularly the single cask. There's so much detail, and the stars really, really have to align to get a shining single cask. And so much of our focus is that, and getting as many casks as we possibly can in our bond store to that magical, the stars align kind of spot. But the reality is, not every single cask in anybody's bond store the world over will not every single cask will be a single cask. There's two types of casks in the world. There's the casks that just are the superstars. They need to be on the stage alone. They don't need any support. They're the Elvises, right? They're just banging. And then there's the casks that they don't have fault. That they're not faulted and problematic. They just work better in teams. And for us, we, through particular barrel management stuff and, just caring in particular ways for the barrels along the way, we can get the vast majority to single cask, and we do that successfully. But there's always going to be those casks that need to be with other casks. It's kind of like, and so a distillery blend, or, a vatted expression in a distillery is kind of like the twin flame of their single cask offering. And I think that, Sometimes I feel like the double cask is kind of seen like the bucktooth cousin of the single casks, which it's not true at all. I mean, not at all. We see ourselves as single cask distilleries, but our double cask program is super, super vital and super important, and it complements the single cask so well. It shows our bond store in another light, and I think that I mean, so much goes into finding a single cask. You're fishing in an ocean, thousands of casks. We taste day in, day out. Everything over the age of 8, we taste at least every quarter. And it's tiring, and a lot of work goes into finding them at that sweet spot. But putting a blended, like a vatted expression together is incredibly time consuming and just as hard, but in another way, because you are trying to take casks that have got very particular characteristics. Some might be really sweet, some might be really spicy, some might be, some might taste real piney, or foresty. And you bring all these like unique characters together, like people in a room, and you got to make a team. And so in double cask case, I usually take portions of about 10 casks. So it's like walking down the street and picking 10 people and then deciding to make the A team out of them, figuring out how the hell you do that.
Yeah.
It's not easy. So it's a really, really wonderful project to take hold of, and I've learned a lot from it, and we all have. But I really think that any distillery's kind of vatted program should always complement the single casks. And yeah. I hope ours does that.
Yeah, well, I think it does. And, I think I'm going to take a page out of Ben Rosson's book, who says, let's drink and talk. So let's get into it. And congratulations. I think it's Iris, it's her first whiskey tasting tonight. So congratulations. You've picked a bloody good one to start with. And I think there was someone else who was their second one. So that's awesome. So in tonight's order, it's going to be very, very simple in terms of the order. We're going to start from the lowest number, 95, then get into 109, 110, and into then the old and rare. So if you want to pour 95, we'll take a nose of it. When Sullivans Cove first started, or well, at least, when here on the mainland, we started to hear about it, and I'm not talking about early days, but, sort of 2011, 12, 13 sort of era before the explosion in 2014 we can talk about. Double cask was designed as an entry-level whiskey, one that was going to get people into, at an affordable price point, get people into Australian whiskey and understanding that concept that they could then go and look at single casks and that sort of thing. Now, as we all know, nothing Sullivans Cove do is entry-level, in terms of their whiskey output. Everything is a premium product that has a Sullivans Cove name on it, including those hoodies I can see there as well, mate, which look very schmick. I reckon I'm going to need one of them. So, I mean, is that 95? Where does this sit for you in the double cask story, and what's it like going back to it tonight?
So, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So DC back in the day, Pat Maguire began the DC as an entry level, as something to kind of tease the palate of the people in Australia, to get us excited about homegrown whiskey. And I say whiskey because back then it was kind of like, oh, you're making scotch in Tassie, like it's our palate as a whiskey drinking community in Australia has changed completely. I understand it's changed completely in a decade, right? So back then it was very much about getting people into it and engaged, and you needed something to be accessible price wise. And the reason, Pat, he started down at 40% ABV, and that was to keep the price down, to keep the excise down, so that the retail price would be lower. So he was really after just getting it in people's homes, getting it in people's glasses, getting engagement, and challenging the palate. So it was designed to be a very easygoing, sweet, smooth, malt-driven, fruity, really, really ultimately just pleasant, beautiful dram. And he achieved that for a number of years. It's gained a cult status and just something that is known to be really yummy. So I came along in 2016, and the whole World Whiskey Awards kaboom a couple of years earlier, it happened. well before my time here, and things have changed. You know, I mean, you all know. You don't need me to tell you how hard it is to get Sullivans. You know, we don't make any more than we were then. And so there's only so much for us to release, and we're really particular about how we do release it. So there's not much out there, but we certainly are no longer in that entry level sort of category. And double cask isn't either. It's known, it's understood, it's out there, and people are drinking whiskey. It's not about getting Australian spirits into people's homes anymore. And so we started toying with the idea, and Fred will remember the conversations of raising the DC ABV, just to kind of play around with, well, what happens if we kind of give the DC a bit of juice, put the turbojets on it, and see how people respond. And so we did it for a special release. We double cask 95. We decided we'd have a bit of a fiddle and find a higher ABV perhaps. And we did. So it was 49, what was it? 49.6. And DC 95 in and of itself, that just went off. Like, it's got a cult following, just that particular batch. And it was really, really well received. We all love it. I still get people in the industry coming up to me and being like, that was so good, like DC 95. And so that taught us a lot about, you know, where people were at in their drinking, and how we could work with the double cask in the future to engage with people further, and also to kind of, you know, see how it's going to evolve. Because, you know, we can't just keep doing exactly the same thing forever. You know, we got to move with people's palates and move with how things are going. So that was a really cool turning point for us. And we've done a few different things since then, where we've played with the ABV on the double cask. We did shortly thereafter kind of raise it to around 45%. And there was a season there of probably a good 10 dozen, maybe a dozen double casks that were around the 45% mark. We're going to taste one of them tonight. It was the last one that was at 45. And then we're also going to taste DC 110, which is the most recent DC. Good to see that you got the 19-year-old, Benny. Well done. And the DC 110 was the first one that we've released where we've said recently, you know what, just like all of our single cask releases, all of our double cask releases are going to have a variable ABV, meaning every time we release one, we're doing an ABV trial here, and we're going to find the sweet spot for that batch. So the DC 110 is a bit higher as well, but DC 95 was that was a really big turning point for us in our understanding of DC, interacting with it, and just, you know, next step of evolution. So it's predominantly younger breakdown. There was a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, and 9-year-old spirit in there. Predominantly the 12, 13-year-old, that was bourbon casks. And then the 20 for the slightly younger component. That's a pretty classic breakdown for a double cask historically. It was around just after that time I started playing with like other casks in the bond store. So, you know, just whiskey refill casks and white wine and a few other bits and bobs. But this is kind of one of the last really, really classic Pat McGuire style. But I've just given a bit more juice. It's on the turbojets.
You've taken Pat McGuire and you've gone full Heather on it.
Yeah. Turned up the heat on Pat.
Yeah. So, I mean, in your journey with Sullivans, how early in, you know, you taking control of managing the blending was 95? And when did this come out? This was
Struth.
17 is when the last 17.
Yeah. So this came out in 17. My first DC was DC 90.
Yeah.
So I've done 20, working on the 21st.
Yeah. And going back to this being such a pivotal release, and it is the oldest. It's sat in the bottle for the longest out of the releases we're going to try tonight. What's it like for you going back and looking at this release now?
Well, it confirms my often thought of esoteric thought that barrel aging spirits is a thing. Bottle aging spirits is a thing. Of course, barrel aging is. I think that it's developed really, really well in the bottle. I know that I mean, enjoyed it from day one. But I love seeing how things develop in the bottle, and some of that spice is really, really integrated as the transition between the nose and the palate and through to the finish, and that's really cool. I love how like dark treacly toffee it is, and you get lots of cinnamon spice. It's a very, very broad, rich dram.
So, I mean, judging by the chat here, there's a few people who've already pointed out that they can't wait to try this again. So there's some people that tried it, but for a lot of people, they won't have tried 95 before.
Yep.
When you're talking about bottle aging, what is it that we're seeing now that we didn't see 3, 4, 5 years ago on this release?
Don't get me wrong. I mean, don't hear me saying that it wasn't integrated when we bottled it. It's not that. It's just I find that when you leave a spirit in a bottle, those tiny little gaps in the integration between the transitions, the gaps get smaller and smaller. So, you think about it's in your nose, you can feel it, it's kind of going all around there, it's filling your nasal passages, and then you take it in your mouth and you can feel it the aromas kind of go down. And then it's swirling around your mouth and you've got, different flavours happening. And then it goes, when you swallow, it goes into the finish. And those transitions between each part, I find that the longer something's in the bottle, if it's a well put together spirit, single cask or not, those transition sort of gaps, they just disappear. And you get this really, really just smooth journey. And texture often gets deeper. And I really, really love DC95. I think it's a banger, and I love seeing how it's pulled together.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite an interesting little thing you're talking about there, Heather. I mean, we're talking about sealed bottles and this sort of thing. Is there, I mean, this is a higher ABV. I know we touched upon it just before we went live. Is it something you see more, in Sullivans Cove, but then in other distilleries as well and other bottlings at higher proofs, or things that aren't chill filtered? Like, what is there? Will my bottle of Jameson get better if I leave it around for 10 years? Like are there certain signifiers for that?
I think it's more profound when you've got no chill filtration, or no colours added, no kind of adulteration. When you've got a raw spirit that hasn't had things taken out of it, it's still got some of those, like, not volatile in a bad way, but they're raw compounds still in there, and they react with each other a little bit more. That's one of the reasons that we take them out for the most part in the industry, right? Because they're going to change in the bottle, and they often visibly change the way that things look on a shelf. So that's why they're taken out predominantly. But we leave them in all of them in Sullivans Cove. We don't do any filtration, and you learn to work with the compounds, and more often than not, that means you just got to go real slow. You just got to be real patient, and it takes longer. But you work with them, and you end up with not having any visual issues in the bottle. But you also end up with all those good things, those textural, flavorful compounds in the bottle forever. And I find that when they're all there and they haven't been filtered out, then you do see more of those parameters kind of closing over time in the bottle, as I was talking about, and slight changes and just textural sort of developments over time, because there's compounds in there that can still change. It doesn't need necessarily a whole bunch of oxygen coming in and out. So I think, the more unadulterated spirits, the more room for fun development in the bottle there is.
Yeah, awesome. Some great tasting notes came up from Tom Scott there, which Simon McGoram's agreeing with, and I'm very, very glad that your pack was found in the sorting warehouse, Simon, at 3 p.m. this Savo, and actually got to you in time. But is giving you one hell of a compliment there by saying an almost Linkwood vibe on the texture, and arguably the greatest Scottish distillery ever known, Linkwood. That is the opinions above are Scott Fitzsimons alone and do not apply to anyone else's. But that's the way I see it. Yeah, I mean, it's such a great whiskey, and it's such a triumph. I mean, when you're making double cask now, because as you sort of alluded to, maybe pre-95, even pre-90, there was a recipe, and particularly in the early ones, there was a flavour profile and a barrel recipe that was going towards. When you're making, say, 96 and then 97, what do you have in your mind that you're aiming towards? Are you trying to replicate something, or are you just making the next double cask, whatever that looks like?
It's it's all of the above. There's a flavour profile that I've kind of found my little niche in. Pat did a brilliant job with starting off, and he had a very particular kind of ratio he'd do between cask types, and that just gave that's where his consistency came. In more recent years, we've had access to the casks the quirky casks that Pat put down like 10 to 15, 16 years ago that he didn't have access to back then. They're coming online. And so I guess the palette is broader for me to choose from and to play with than he had. And it's the right thing to do to use all those casks as well, because the double cask should be a really great representation of the breadth of Sullivans Cove Bond Store. Just as, it makes sense, like realistically, we're a small distillery. We don't have anywhere near as many casks as the big Scottish distilleries do to play with. And so it's our house representation of who we are. So it's not just the bourbon casks and the French oak tawny casks that are used, being able to play with, all sorts of others. And so I've kind of found a very particular sort of recipe that the double cask is based on now. It's not the same every time because the casks that we have available to play with are not the same all the time. So there's a lot of tweaking and playing that goes on putting each of the batches together, which is a lot of fun. It's infuriating at times, and you go through a couple of existential crises every batch and creative dilemmas, and it keeps me up at night sort of thing. But it's all part of it, and it's a really, really cool thing. So there's consistency in flavour, but there's consistency in quality, and so quality markers like texture and integration and kind of narrative, the journey that it takes you on. So it's not consistency and it has to taste exactly the same every time. A bond store of our size is never, ever going to achieve that. So each one's a little bit of an artwork.
Yeah. Just to put things in perspective, and I think we'll talk a little bit about TD versus HH and what that is and what that means in a little while. But for those playing at home, this was a vatting of 3 casks, TD3, TD37, and TD285. So I just want people to sort of remember that this was all TDs and quite early TDs, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But I think that's an excellent little segue into. I think we could sit on 95 all night and go nowhere else, but it's unfortunate we do have to move on. It's very, very tough. We have to try all 4 tonight, not just sit on one. But we're now going to move into 109 and 110. So this is going to be a really good example of 2 releases, done subsequently, and we're going to be able to see exactly, a window into your mind a little bit about how it developed across these 2 releases. So. We'll jump into 9, and certainly if you've got 95 and you haven't finished it, don't rush. These are whiskies that took a long, long time to make, so they deserve a long, long time to be enjoyed. You've got all night to do that, but if you want to find another glass and maybe pour in a little bit of 109, because these are the 2 most recent on the market, 109 and 110.
That's correct. And I kind of alluded to it before, but 109 and 110, we chose these 2 because they're side by side, and so there's a lot of kind of similar DNA. There's some overlapping casks that are in both of them, because I've picked, bits from the same cask. They're not all the same, of course. They're quite unique. But 109 was the last DC that we released at 45%, where we said, DC that sits at 45%, that's the last one. 110 is where we felt, just like DC 95, it was time for a bit of a growth spurt in DC. We felt it was ready to kind of mature a little bit. So it's DC's next grown-up steps. And that's the first one where we said, we just want to let the liquid tell us where on the ABV spectrum it sits best and where we should bottle it at, where we should dilute it to. So you'll see that they're quite similar in their, their aromatic profile and whatnot, but you'll see DC 110's just got that extra bit of oomph, extra bit of depth to it. But let's start with DC 109.
Sorry, would you actually recommend people, if you've got two glasses, put these together, or do
Yeah,
you
let's
want to
do
just
it.
get them?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
do it side by side. Honestly, like pour them all. Where we don't chill filter, so anything non-chill filtered, just like the bottle aging stuff, like get everything in a glass. Air is its friend.
The most important thing here that I'm reminding myself of, and I remind everyone at home, these look exactly the same in the glass. So make sure you know what's in your left hand and what's in your right hand, because I've definitely made that mistake before in my whiskey drinking life. So for me, at least, 109 in the left hand, 110 in the right hand. And I want to. It's something we're not trying tonight. I was going to mention it earlier, but Matt Bailey, thank you for joining the Whiskey and Ailment Double Cask that you did for our friends down in Melbourne. That was unbelievable. I think that, for me, sits up near 95 and 100 is one of the best double casks I've ever tried.
Banger. Words out of my mouth, Matt. Absolute ripper and banger. That again was another pivotal double cask where kind of figured out the beauty of having an older and a younger contrast in an older component and a younger contrast in the DC, and that's the last one we get to tonight is going to be taking a leaf out of that book as well. So, that's an exciting one to get to.
Yeah. So, these are quite new. I'm going to just read out. I'll read out the specs for people. And I am seeing the questions come through. I will get to them. But a few people are asking questions that I have in my mind to ask about the final whiskey. So I'm going to hold on to those questions and incorporate them into things I've got written down here. So DC 109 was at 45 exactly. Barrel numbers are HH464. Then TDs, and I'll rush these, but TDs 99, 313, 322, 326, 335, 276, 295, 321, and 399. And then number 110, which was at 46.9, so slightly higher. We got HH 80, then in TDs 87, 105, 209, 276, 295, 322, 332, 399, and 291. So as you say, there's a few overlapping numbers here. But for those who may not be absolute Sullivans Cove historians, like I know a few people in the chat are, what the hell am I talking about when I talk about HH and TD? I'm talking about numbers on barrels, and so whether there was 10 barrels or 4 barrels or whatever it was in a release. But what am I gibbering on about?
So if you see, this is classic Sullivan's lingo. If you see the little prefix, like HH or TD, refers to an ownership period, ultimately. So HH was one of the earlier ownership periods, Highland Holdings, and TD is Tas Distillery. So that was Pat Maguire's era of ownership. And one day you'll see SC from the most recent, the current era. So there was some slight differences in the way they ran the still, barrel programs and whatnot. But honestly, there's a very particular Sullivans Cove DNA thread through all of them. Same still the whole time, predominantly the same barrels being filled the whole time. So, I guess every era of every distillery has a kind of an essence to it. Different distillery manager, different person kind of overseeing things, and so slightly different parameters here and there. But ultimately, Sullivans has been really lucky in that we've had the same still. So there's a very particular flavour that you get from Myrtle. She's a really unique still, and we've had a series of all throughout our ownership periods of. There's been changes in the way things have been done, but ultimately there's been the same direction, and there's been some absolutely banging spirit produced through the whole era, and the spirits all marry up really, really well, which I think shows that the DNA is the same, and that continues to this day. So. Just like every distillery, there's different phases of ownership and, leaders in the business. So there's slightly different fingerprints here and there, but they're all Sullivan's casks.
Yeah. I mean, and that, like, just to put it back on you again a little bit, you obviously weren't there when the HH, was you were sort of at towards the end of the TD period and now, firmly hands on at SC. What's it like for you going back? And we've seen with the 95 only had TD casks in it. But, you're now dipping into a previous era of the distillery cask you're sort of playing with. You couldn't control what was going on back then. And, Sullivans, as you say, has been lucky enough to create excellent spirit the whole way through. But there have been, casks that have, slipped through the cracks and, from the early days and that sort of thing. So what's it like for you? And in this case, there's one HH cask in both of them. So how do you approach those very old casks? Is it just trial and error, and some are great and some you go, okay, I'm going to have to figure out something to do with this?
It's the same process with all of them, honestly. I think they each have different characteristics, just like, a bourbon cask is different from a tawny cask. You just learn their little niches and how they like to be treated, who they like to hang out with in a vatted expression, and, how they like to be treated in the bond store. You just get to know them like your kids, really. Honestly, like, they've all got their quirks. I would say that the quirks, the uniquenesses between the different age kind of groups are no more extreme than the uniquenesses between the different cask types. It's just getting to know your colour palette.
Yeah. I'm going to ask this question before we go too much further, and before someone asks it in the chat. You mentioned very flippantly, quickly, you moved to Tassie initially to, work in wine and that sort of thing. And you just touched upon colour palette there. Is where do we buy one like yours? Like, where do we get a palette like yours? How have you found yourself? Because you're so young and you're driving this next generation of Australian whiskey forward. Is it just purely experience, or how have you got to the level that you have to be able to analyze these things?
I don't know, man. I hate getting asked the question because I don't know.
But I ask it every time I sit next to you or do something. Because I learn something new every time. And it's like, shit, she's got better again.
Sorry. Well, I think, honestly, I think the wine industry is really, really, really great training ground. Matt's just mentioned the Club Renault. Go Club Clio. We both own Clios. Anyway.
Your palette's definitely better than Matt Bailey's as well, as is your haircut. I'll add that in.
So I think the wine industry is a great learning kind of ground for anyone's palate. The spirits industry, we're young, we're still figuring out our educational platforms. We don't have really, 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 really banging palate training systems that have been proven over decades and like hundreds of years for training people's palates and spirits. But the wine industry does, as does the beer industry. And just the way of thinking about things that go in your mouth, go through your nose, whether it's structure, how it's put together. The wine industry has that, and I was lucky enough to pick that up. I think that, I don't know, like sometimes people read probably not sometimes, really often people read my tasting notes, and like you hear people waffling off tasting notes and you think, God, they're a wanker, or God, they have such a great palate. And I think that, I firmly believe, just because you can use floral language doesn't mean you got a good palate. It means you can smell things and you can pick things out, but what are you going to do with that? I think a good palate can, the next step in your evolution of your palate is understanding what those smells mean, understanding what that texture means, and being like, all right, so where did that smell come from? Was it in the still, or was it in the barrel? Was it in the fermentation? Was it the grain? How can I make that work with what we're doing here? The same with the texture, where's that come from? How did that develop? Figuring all of those things out. So using the data that your nose and your palate is giving you and turning it into something meaningful that you can use to make something delicious. Work with the colour palette you've got. So I think that the wine industry for me was really, really great in kind of setting that foundation. I know there's a lot of other distillers that are in the same boat as that. But then I've been very, very lucky at Sullivans of having such a broad and expansive bond store to play with. And, honestly, like, I'm just one of many palates in Sullivans. All of our distillers have amazing palates. All our front of house guys have amazing palates. You kind of bounce off each other and you kind of egg each other on and encourage each other to grow as well. So I think there's a dose of being a geek and just loving it and being really lucky with having a sick bond store to play with.
And if anyone's wondering, what that exact difference between sort of enlightened tasting notes and the wanker tasting notes are, go to the Sullivans Cove website and then go to anything I've written on the Oak Barrel website, and you'll see very much wanker on the Oak Barrel under Scott Fitzsimons. You'll see enlightened.
That's not true,
no, I was a music journalist and did CD reviews. I do wanker tasting notes with the best of them. Look, let's. Everyone should have had a good chance to sit with 109 and 110 now. I think this is an excellent example of the fact that you have, the same DNA, and there's Sullivans across all DNA across all Sullivans, let alone just in double cask. These are the same, but and particularly, I'm really going to focus on the people who might be new to Sullivans, and someone's their first whiskey tasting tonight. Can we see the differences between the two? And I certainly can. These are two different whiskies, and but they form the part of things. So, I mean, talk us through, maybe the cask makeup or how you approached 109 and 110.
So 109, it was a bit of a turning point. We had decided as a group, and I'd certainly been kind of feeling it within myself for a while, that we need to take the DC to the next level. And open it up to just whatever the liquid tells us, which is the approach we have of all our single casks. So it makes sense to me that we do it for all our liquid. And so DC 109, it was like, okay, this is the last DC that we're going to bottle at 45% because that's just what we bottle it at. So I really just wanted to do a double cask that was the best at 45%. So it was actually remarkably hard to put together. I spent more time on this one than I have on a double cask for a long time, because it was actually making a double cask specifically to an ABV and being like, what is the absolute best we can get from 45%? This is the last one we're going to do, so it's got to be a friggin' ripper. And just really, really tweaking at 45 to get the most coming out. And I've found 45, and the lower you go, the harder it is to get a really voluptuous nose and a long, lengthy palate. Because you've got more water in it, the lower you go. It sounds obvious, but if you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, it's like you got cordial, and it's the difference between your friend's mum, who you like going to their house because they don't put too much water in the cordial, or church cordial on Sunday, which is always really watered down. There's
very,
a difference.
Very Australian reference there, but I love it.
Yeah, the old Coddies reference. I know it sounds funny, but I always think of dilution as cordial. That's just what's in my brain about, the more you put in, it's still going to taste good. It's sugar water, it's cordial, and it's a spirit, right? It's going to taste good, but it's going to be a little bit more watered down and not going to have so much jumping out at you. So going to a variable ABV where there is a bit more oomph in there kind of is a bit more fun. But certainly DC 109, I was like, no, this has to be a ripper. Let's see what all we can get out of 45, the most we can get, so I could put it to rest and be like, yeah, we did a good thing and we're ready to go to the next level. Whereas with DC 110, it was more like, okay, let's put together a really ace, structural, really, really good vatting, double cask, and then let it tell us where it wants to sit. So it might sound like a little difference, as in I'm just playing with ABV, but when we were putting together the double cask, it is profoundly a different process.
Yeah. I mean, on the nose, the tasting notes are different, but you can even at that minute, and maybe this is my mind playing tricks on me, but even at that minute ABV difference, it feels like, 110's got just a little bit more to say. It's got a bigger front to it. It's a little bit more brash. And I think Simon just sort of echoes that in the chat there. So 109 is no slouch. That is a brilliant whiskey. Just has that oomph to it.
It is. It's just that bit of extra oomph, and there's no better way of describing it. It's just got a little bit more juice on it. Just dropped a gear. And I find interestingly with the Sullivans, it's a tasting note that you often get in our single cask, because we often release them, 47+%. It's a tasting note you often get in there is that cocoa. And that is something that has been in all the eras. It's a very particular note. It's very Sullivans. And I find, when you're in the lower ABVs, it hides a bit. But the DC 110, just on the nose, the difference between the 109 and the 110, the 109 is much more fruity. It's all candied and like green fizzes, lime, musky stuff. And DC 110, all of a sudden you're like, ooh, Cadbury, drinking chocolate, cocoa powder, it just gets that chocolatey level. It's good.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and it's amazing how different they are. The question I want to ask you mentioned, and there was a question from Ollie Maruda, I think, a little bit earlier that I'm going to try and scroll back and find about how many casks are in the warehouse at the moment. And I'm going to sort of tie this in with the fact that you used some of these barrels across both releases. So Sullivans is still producing, I believe, the same amount as it always has. There's not going to be a Sullivans on every shelf in every bottle store in the world in any time soon. So, when you were dragging from these casks, are these casks that are sitting in tanks somewhere that you're then dipping in like from a spice rack and pulling into releases, or what does it actually look like? And are you taking these out of barrel, or are you taking them out of and putting them into a tank and letting them sit there? So how does that process work? And particularly relating to casks being used in more than one release.
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question because we often talk about, you blend, blah, 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 and move on, but how it happens, don't often talk about the mechanics of it. So I prefer to decant a whole cask. So, we'll be tasting, and, we'll find a single cask every now and then. But every now and then there'll also be casks that we've been tracking, and I'm just thinking, we feel like this is going to end up in a double cask. Over time, it consistently says it needs to be paired with something and some other casks to find its full potential. So we'll decant that cask and leave it on the floor. And that it is like a spice rack, literally. So there's a bunch of casks down there in vats that will go around and pick and choose. So because of that, there is it's sort of like a mother, I suppose, but there is a theme that goes throughout, consecutive double casks. You might get one cask that's split over 3 DCs. And so you have like an organic sort of similarity, which helps given that, we don't have a bazillion casks to choose from and get the flavour the same every time. But I also don't want to be out there taking 20 litres or 50 litres or 70 litres out of a barrel and leaving it out there, because obviously the more you take, the lower the volume, the more the evaporation. So, prefer to decant them and use them as a spice rack.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean that makes a lot of sense, and I've been to the Sullivans Cove Distillery and the warehouse there, and it's a Willy Wonka's booze factory for people who love this sort of stuff. But there's always things moving and things happening and things being brought down and that sort of stuff. You sort of mentioned that everything over 8 years you try and taste every quarter, was it, or every half year or something like that?
Yeah.
So
in other words, really regularly. You're just keeping your finger on the pulse.
Yeah. So I mean, what is do you then find stuff maybe like a barrel that's at 9 years and go, I don't know what I'm going to use this for, but I don't think this is going to get any better. I'm just going to decant this, sit over there, and I'll find a use for it in the future. Does that ever happen?
No, only if I've got a use for it straight away. Because honestly, unless a barrel has proved itself over time to be heading in a certain direction, the best place it can be is in the barrel. Don't particularly just decant barrels not knowing which direction they'll go for.
Yeah. No, fascinating. Lots of chat about the 109 versus 110 here. A few people who have got other releases at home that they're also putting into this tasting. That say Dan mentioned that he's got 103 and 109 open, both at 45%, and the 109 has a lot more body, but then the 110 pushes that up again. So I mean, yeah, like I definitely see that, and I think it's a great thing that double cask just keeps getting better and better. I mean,
Yeah.
like we want to go back to like the first ever double cask I tried was at 40%, and it was the entry level, try and get people into whiskey, and that was a good whiskey. I'm not saying like they were bad whiskeys, but it just
nothing we're saying here tonight. And please don't hear me say that those double casks are no good. Like, it absolutely not. They're banging whiskies, and because of that, we've been able to work with them and evolve them along the way.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. With the single casks, whether they be American oak or tawny or whatever they are, there's been there's excellent, and then there's very, very excellent or brilliant, however you want to call it. And they sort of jump up and down a little bit. And there's some that I like, and there's ones I preferred last year's. I prefer this one better last year's, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas DC double cask continues to get better. For me, it's the one thread in Sullivan's armory that just keeps growing and growing and growing. Is that something specific to me, or is that something that you guys see at the distillery as well?
You do too, and it's really encouraging to hear that, because we put a lot of work into getting it like really, really consistent in quality. And I know quality, for a craft style distillery is, it doesn't mean like Jameson it tastes the same every time. But with single casks, they're a curious beast, a curious and wonderful beast. Like they're never the same each time. They're fingerprints of nature, right? You can't have the same thing twice. And so consistency, again, is really tricky. And we wrestle with this day to day in our tasting panels of like, we find that's a really, really, really great French oak tawny. That's a really great expression of who we are, but it's not going to taste like the last one we released. And so that's something we really almost angst over at times, is where's the boundary in a label with people's expectations of flavour and style and whatnot. And, I think that the boundaries are a little bit more blurred with a single cask, because it has to be. You're talking about unique people, individual personalities, like people. You've got people sitting next to each other. They can be all from the same family, but they ain't the same people. And there's an element of that in double cask, but with double cask, there's an ability to be a bit more consistent in the flavour profile. It's never going to be the same every time. Don't want it to be. It's not the way we roll. But yeah, it's a really interesting point you make, that the flavour profile and whatnot changes with the single cask, and because they're each like individual people, you gravitate personally to certain releases. Because you have a palate, you have an individual palate that's based on your life experience, the things that you've tasted and smelt, and all the things in your life. And just like you walk into a room or into a pub and you gravitate towards certain people, and other people you're like, yeah, I'm sure you're a really nice person, but I just like this Mr. Muscat over here a little bit better. And I'm going to chat to Mr. Muscat tonight and have a great night.
Yeah, it tends to be the people holding Sullivan's Cove bottles in their hand that we tend to gravitate towards in pubs. Look, that's been fascinating, and a really good example of where double cask is. Before we move on to the last week, you start talking about that. You mentioned DC 110. That's the most recent, that came out about 6 weeks ago or something like that. Presumably come and gone as all Sullivans Cove releases do. DC 111. What does that look like? How far down the process for that are you?
I'm putting it together at the moment. So it's a kind of an exciting time, I guess, for me, putting the DCs together, because it's like, okay, so we did 110, really happy with it. It's a banger, really excited. But I've kind of got to realign the blending brain again to that new way of putting the DC together. So, exciting, creative patch for me, and for all of us, as we kind of slightly tweak our understanding of double cask and its expression. Putting it together. I've got some, there'll be some similarities in the casks from DC 110, but there's also some big differences in some of the other casks going there as well. So I've decanted a few fresh casks that haven't been in anything before, obviously.
Excellent. So, like, that's something to look forward to. As there's always something from Sullivan's Cove to look forward to. But as again, if you've still got those two going, your first and foremost, your patience is exceptional, because even though I say be patient, take your time, these are evaporating out of my glasses very quickly once they hit the palate for the first time. But feel free to put them to a side if you haven't finished them, because we might move into the reason why we're here, and was going to be the reason why we, for the first time in 7 years, we could welcome Sullivans Cove back to the fair and actually put you on a stand and do something really, really cool, which is something called DCOR 01. So I might bring up a photo of it quickly, and Heather, if you want to just do a bit of introduction into what this is and why it carries a different name to the DCs we've tried.
So DCOR kind of loosely means DC Old and Rare. There's a large chunk of this is bloody old, basically. So over 50, it's about 55% or so is 18 or 20-year-old whiskey, so bourbon casks. So that's pretty significant for a double cask. I mean, the average age for a double cask would be like, I think the average age of the cask in a double cask is 13. DC 109 and 110 had casks that were 7 years old and 17 years old in them. So there's a spread, but the vast majority is around 11, 12, 13 years old in the bulk of the DCs. This one, the vast majority was 18 or 20 years old. So that's a significant portion. So that's going to have a really significant impact on the style. Every part of it, the way it feels in your nose, the aromas from the style of whiskey that was being produced back then, the texture, the flavour profile. So there's a whole lot of old stuff in there. There's also some younger stuff. There's some younger bourbon. 9-year-old bourbon is the youngest. But the bulk is 18 or 20-year-old bourbon casks. And that's the bourbon component. The fortified and the wine component, there's French oak tawny, American oak tawny, and French oak white wine casks, which make up the rest of it. And so this one, Matt mentioned the whiskey and almond double cask, and Scott's mentioned DC 100, which also had a whole lot of old stuff in it as well. They were both DCs. We put a serious component of old liquid in, and a smaller but also considerable component of younger stuff to complement. And it's a practice that works really well. It's an excellent complementary mix. When you've got that really, really settled, thick, old, he knows who it is. It's just, old wise man kind of whiskey as a really good foundation, and then you can have some bright, youthful elements pulling in and, making quite the marriage.
Yeah. So, I'm going to bring up this the label here so people can see it nice and clear, and we can sort of understand what's in this. So, to put things in perspective, and why I'm on the verge of tears right now is we've had a long and storied relationship with Sullivans Cove. Well before my time here at the Oak Barrel, and Heather, before your time at Sullivans as well. In 2014, I was a punter at Sydney Whisky Fair. We were literally filling Sullivans Cove out of a 20-litre barrel for an exclusive release at the fair that year, which was very, very cool. Little did we know that 2014 would also be a year that something else happened to Sullivans, and the world started to take notice, and it's been very, very difficult to source any of the releases since then. So we have been working with you guys throughout that time, and I joined very shortly after that. I've been at the Oak Barrel for almost 7 years now, so that was the lines up when I started on to do something together that made sense. And we just didn't want to do a Sullivans Cove single cask for the sake of doing something really, really special that not only was something we were both proud of, but would tell the story and push forward into the future with blending, which is what we're all talking about. So, it's such a joy for me to present this to people tonight. But let's look at the labels. So we've got some very old casks here. I can see, we've got TD368, but then HH368, but then HH037, which is going back a long way. Presumably they're your 18 and 20-year-old casks. How did this come about, and how did this release get its birth?
Oh, it's putting the older and younger combo DCs together has happened a couple times. Epic results. Some of, I think, everybody's favourite DCs, kind of like with the DC 95, it's got cult status in and of itself just for a particular batch. And I don't know, sometimes I get a little bored. This is a terrible thing to say, but it's kind of nice to be like, right, what kind of fun DC can we put together? And I get a little bit carried away sometimes. But there's, I've got all the stuff on the floor to play with. There's fun barrels out there that come along, and it's nice to be able to play with the whole variety of the Bond store. And generally, the older casks don't make their way into the current DC. But there's older casks out there that, just like we were saying, there's the Elvis casks, and there's the casks that are they're absolutely amazing team players. And so, just because a cask is super, super old doesn't mean it's more destined to be a single cask. It's, liquid is liquid. So you can't force a cask, just like a person, to be someone that's not. So there are casks out there that, that are really, really old, and it's like, they're really, really old, and show it the respect it deserves and put it where it needs to be. And yeah, just like we found with the Whiskey and Almond one and the DC 100, older casks, particularly the older bourbon casks, they're such a good base to bring some younger wine related casks in. And particularly like structurally, the older bourbon casks, and you guys who've had like the HH, the old and rare American oak bourbon casks, are familiar with that flavour profile and the texture, you'll know how like thick it is. And it's such a good base structurally to form a DC on, to form a vatted expression on. When you've got that really thick, gooey American oak base, you want some finer structure. So some of the French oak in there is really good. But the tawny just gives it that really lifted, luscious cocoa and dried fruits and kind of molassesy stuff. So it's a really, honestly, it makes a lot of sense. And I dare say it won't be the last that we do like that. It's something that works really, really well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a gorgeous release, and Old and Rare has appeared in the single cask format before. And this is the first of in the double cask. There's one thing that I want to ask on this that people might be seeing on here. I'm trying to get around and announce it today and tell everyone this is a brand new release, for Whisky Fair and the Oak Barrel's 65th anniversary. But if you're looking on that label there, it says the youngest was filled in the year 2000 and decanted on 2010. So is this a cask that's been sitting around waiting for its time to shine? And it is, this release is technically a 9-year-old because of that period. It didn't quite get to 10, so that's why it's a 9-year-old. So what's going on here?
It's HH368. That's the number. Yeah, so it's the top left on the side tag. That's a hilarious story, actually. I won't go into too much detail, but it will be here all night. It's a bit of a saga, but it was a cask that was decanted and bottled, and back in 2010, I honestly don't even know how it ended up happening, but it ended up being stuck on a pallet. It kind of lost in the back of the distillery, and for whatever reason, I don't actually, know how it's actually unfolded. It was just in the back of the distillery for a decade, and we found it a few years back, and we're like, hey, what's this? So really, really, really old whiskey, old as in from ages ago, and we've reinvented it. So, but it's actually a really nice, really banging whiskey, super, super textural, and got a really nice kind of warm, sandy, reminds you of summer beach kind of aroma to it. So that was a really big help in this one. So it's a quirky one, which it's a good pickup. You think 2010? Wait on, was that a typo?
Definitely made a typo there on that typo. One. Yeah. But okay, so if that's 368 and that was filled on 2000, and then by definition that is the youngest, so that's why it gets the label here, because you need to label the youngest.
Yes, correct.
Cask HH37 must be ancient by that because it's
Yeah,
300.
we're talking geriatric. Yeah, so it's a 20-year-old.
So that's the 20-year-old
It's
cask.
a 20-year-old component.
And when was that? When was that distilled and filled? About that same sort of era, or
It would have been. Oh well, it would have been 2000, 99, 2000, probably 99. It's been decanted for a little minute, so yeah.
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 Awesome. I mean, it's like
this is a while ago. I mean, God, 1999. I was 11. I think of that. God, I always think about what I was doing when I see the distill date.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know we're the same age and you've achieved so much more than me so far and have such a better palate than me on that, just on that note. But moving along very, very quickly. So, and just to clarify that, from Ollie there, so that that lost cask, it sat in bottle in the back of the bond store, and you just opened the bottles, poured it back into a tank, and then mixed it in here. Yeah, okay. So that's why they're the youngest in here is 9, but it's living up to the old and rare status and name by being from a previous era.
It's an interesting one because the HH designation you don't often see. We certainly don't see now, like things with the HH designation that are so young. Usually when you see on our bottles HH, you're like, oh my God, it's like halfway to the grave. That thing is old. So yeah, really interesting. 9-year-old HH. So if you're a follower of the distillery and you know those kind of prefixes, and that's a cool bit of trivia and a really unique component in this release.
I love when you look at these little stickers and, the labels on Sullivans Cove is always really well put together, but I get excited about these little stickers because you look at that and you go, on such a small piece of the label, there are so many stories in here. Let's, without further ado, I know a few people have. I've sat with this whiskey. So this is, to put things in perspective, this whiskey is an exclusive to the Oak Barrel. It's something we wanted to work on together and has been is very, very special. But it's not at the Oak Barrel. It's sitting at Sullivans Cove right now in the resting period. So for me, and I've seen some comments coming through on the chat there, but we rushed a couple of bottles up for this, and honestly, this took me 24 hours to get my head around. In terms of when I first nosed it, then I nosed it 24 hours later, and then a few days after that, and it just kept evolving and changing. And even I nose it today, and it's completely different from when I tried it 3 weeks ago or whenever that was. So, I mean, what's your thought process in we're going to release a little bit for the pre-sale tomorrow at midday on the website because we're doing this and it feels good to actually release that. But then we're going to wait until it actually arrives. But that could be 3 or 4 weeks still before it gets to us. So what's your thought process in leaving it there? And does age have any part to play in that?
Yeah. So when we bottle something, and this is similar for wine, right? You bottle something, and even though like we've got a really gentle bottling system, it still gets a little jiggied up. It's still got to go through all the pipes and into the bottle, and then it's it's moved around in the bottling room, and then it's in a box and it's carted here and there, and it goes through a little bit of a minor shock, and so it's important for us that we will let things sit for a pretty decent period of time sometimes before we sell it. So when you see the EDMs and things being sold, that doesn't mean the bottling room has just thrown whiskey at the sales department and they're like, quick, let's sell it. It's been sitting in a warehouse for a little minute, weeks, if not a couple months, just to find itself again. And so we're in that settling period now. And, you hear wine people talking about that. You bottle it and then it's bottle shock, and you just got to let it sit for a while before it's ready to go out the door. Same thing. So Scotty's he's spot on. I mean, you taste it and it evolves, and it's just got to find itself again.
It's just in the announcement today, I went and looked back at my tasting notes I'd written in those first 48 hours, and a colleague of mine, Joe Perry, who has better tasting notes than me because, funnily enough, he looks after the wine department, so he's better at that than I am. And going back to it, we both looked at it and said, we're going to look like absolute idiots when people read this, because right now it doesn't taste like it's a completely different kettle of fish than it was when we first tried it. So there are some on the website, but don't take them for gospel. I do want to shout out to quickly to Fred, who mentioned the white stripes, which is the stripe across the label here. And my favourite bit is actually the red, which is the official oak barrel burgundy hue of red that appears in our logo and on a few things around the website as well, which makes me very excited. But this carries a white stripe across the label, which historically has been for releases that don't sit inside American Oak Ex Bourbon or French Oak Tawny. Is that just to designate it to be as a little bit different to a double cask, or what's the thinking here?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with our branding and our labels and our distillery, you'll know there's the classic black label. It's all black. It's the American Oak Ex Bourbon, that the black has become anything that's American oak. And the blue label, that's your classically French Oak Tawny, but we've got a couple of variations that have been coming through in recent times. So there might be a black or a blue label with a different coloured stripe through it, and that's signifying that this is an American oak or a French oak, but it's not American Oak Bourbon and it's not French Oak Tawny. It could be American Oak Tawny. It's got a black label for American oak and a blue stripe for Tawny. Or it signifies a refill cask with a kind of a pate sort of colour going through it. With the double cask, we thought, well, let's do a double cask label and put a stripe through it to signify that it's double cask, but not your typical double cask. So if you see a stripe through something, you think variation. Ooh, this is something a little bit different from the normal.
Yeah. So I'm aware of the fact that you probably don't want to be sitting at the distillery all night and you want to go home, but can we
not a bad place to be.
Yeah. I know that you sort of touched upon there, but if we could just break this down. So we've got the two HH casks, which are American Oak Ex Bourbon barrels. So that's giving, that's the bulk. I think about 55% is that 18/20-year-old sort of stock. Then we've got a younger HH cask here. Is that the wine cask?
No, that's the one that was in the bond store for Yonks in bottle.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So that's that one.
So we've got two. The 368 was the 9-year-old. 9-year-old bourbon. 37 was an 20-year-old bourbon. HH 616 was a 18-year-old bourbon. Then we got TD 31. Am I reading right? Yeah, 313, 322, and 99. 313 and 322 are both Tawny casks. One's French and one's American. And 99 is a French oak white wine cask.
Which is that's quite unique. What did the white wine cask add to this sort of selection?
Well, you find them in most of the double casks. Honestly, the last at least half a dozen have had some white wine in them, and it gives a really particular herbal note. It's dark, sultry. It's very much like a beautiful Amaro, like a bitter herbal Alpine Amaro. And it's in there, and there's not often much in there, but without it, it's not the same. And you find that with each of the components. Some of them form a bulk for structure and for base, and then there's other components that have much smaller parts. There's some cask types I put 2% in maximum each time, but without it, it's not the same. It needs it. So we're talking about tiny, tiny amounts, and you think, oh, come on, like surely no. But makes a difference. We don't have massive batches. We release with our regular double casks. There might be like 1,400 bottles at the most, but the difference of 20 litres is a big difference. So it's pretty nitpicky work putting them together like that, with all the different kind of flavour profiles mixing together.
And just on that, we will actually get into what it actually tastes like in a second, but which is the most important bit, obviously. But 45.9% in the ABV. What was your thinking on that? Was that just a trial and error and hit the sweet spot?
Yeah, 100%. Same approach as DC 110, and like single cask approach as well. So when we do an ABV trial, we'll line up like 10 or 11 glasses, and there might be 0.1% increment each of them. We might start at 0.5 and then maybe do another one at 0.1 or whatever, and then narrow it down. And you'd think again, what does 0.1% actually make in a difference? It makes a whole lot of difference. And particularly when you start looking at different styles of spirit, particularly with different age ranges and whatnot, that it makes a very big difference, and you find certain things going into certain ranges and fitting in well. But it's that's absolutely the product of a bunch of us sitting down with a billion glasses and screwing our minds over, trying to find where it sits best.
Yeah. And it's just been pointed out in the chat, and we're going to talk about this very quickly, because when we the samples we drew this from, this doesn't have a label on it. This isn't a this is why this is pre the settling period, before they were able to be labelled, and the sample that has been brought from is 45.2%. You can't see it there, but if I bring that up. Yeah, so 45.2. It is the same juice, and it is actually at 45.9. We're going to assume that that's just a bit of a typo there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So typo. That's good.
Sorry.
Take that bonus 0.7% on us. It's in the glass, but that's what happens with cask samples. So before we get into the tasting notes, because you're so passionate about that settling period, and that becomes before anything. This is arguably the worst time ever to try this whiskey. It's only going to get better from here once it settles out.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to kind of see where it's going to end up is just to leave it in the glass for half a. To be honest, give it some air, give it some movement, give it some warmth, and yeah, I think it's really coming together well. Big time cocoa chocolate.
I'm getting heaps of that, that cocoa thing, but also like a really buttery vanilla and that sort of stuff. I was when we first cracked this, and the bottles just rocked, and that was we weren't giving this a settling period. As soon as it landed from the delivery driver, it was cracked. About 30 seconds afterwards. A lot more sort of like. Citrus peel and orange, and then for me, leather on the nose. Like it was, and that's why I mentioned earlier, it took me 24 hours to sort of get my head around it, because it was this very old whiskey on the nose, but then very DC double cask on the palate. And then the two have come together in the last little while. I'm getting much less of that, that leather armchair thing, and a lot more of that bright fruit coming through on this pass.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really rich, buttery, vanilla-y, it's almost like custard tart with nutmeg on it kind of thing. Like that's really classic American oak bourbon stuff, particularly the old stuff, and that lifted. And that's all really good, but sometimes if it's just on its own, like you can be gluggy almost, and you need some sort of bright, lifty bits. And as it pulls together, they're really there. So I often, the wine-related casks are great for that. Yeah.
So, I mean, I know what I think of it, and I think that's pretty obvious what I think of it. But sitting back now, Heather, like where does this sit in the canon of whiskies that you've produced? You've obviously worked with some exceptional releases. We've spoken about a lot of them tonight. We've tried, 95 tonight. But you've worked with old and rare in single cast. You've worked with special cast releases, all that sort of stuff. From a Sullivans Cove point of view, and you sort of driving the production there, where does this release sit for you?
It's a happy place. I really, really love, the vatting and the vatted expressions we do. It's because it is such a really, really great complement to our single cask, and it's such it's a really, really wonderful expression of the breadth of our bond store. You get that with the single cask, but one cask type at a time, whereas bringing them all together is this whole other flip side and another beautiful aspect of the bond store that, the single casks, obviously they're single, that, they're unique people. And, sometimes it's I know it's the metaphor that we keep using, but it's like having an amazing singer, like an opera singer, like Jesse Norman, or, an amazing opera singer who got a beautiful voice on their own, or a choir, and they're both showing beautiful human voices, but in a different way, in a different context. So, yeah, I really, really love working on the double cask, and I just as much as, it's amazing seeing a really cool single cask leave the stable. And I know, we're a single cask distillery, and that's sort of what we're known for predominantly, but equally as much, it's a really wonderful thing to put these together and throw them out into the world.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And just on that note, I mean, it's been, as I said, it's been a thread through the Whisky Forum this week. A lot of distilleries who may have released their first, 10 whiskies as single casks is now starting to look at, in-house blending and trying to create that flavor profile. I know there's some distillers and people on the chat here tonight. Like, for those maybe getting into this, or even, people at home like myself with an infinity bottle that we're playing around with at home, just mixing our dregs and that sort of stuff. Like is because any tips or things apart from going and spending 10 years working in the wine industry that that we can maybe like learn or not be scared of to try when we're blending flavors together to create something bigger than the sum of its parts?
I think the only way you'll find out is if you give it a crack. So I don't think there's anything to be afraid of. I mean, the things that I've put together, I laugh sometimes thinking about the things that I've put together. I mean, hell's bells, I've mixed brandy and whiskey together and been like, wonder what that's going to do. It's not good. I can tell you now, you don't have to do that. But I think it's just about trialing and error. Just mix things together, mix them in different ABVs, mix them at, different ratios. But ultimately, the most important thing is to know your color palette. Know what you've got at hand. And the only way you can do that is just taste, smell, keep your finger on the pulse of every single one of your barrels every few months. And if you understand each of your components then and how they interact with each other, then you figure it out. Every distillery's got unique spirit, and there's principles that you can follow, but ultimately it's your spirit. So you have to know it and figure it out, and that takes a long time and lots of tasting.
So drink more whiskey, essentially.
Drink more whiskey is the ultimate principle. Yeah.
Yeah. The finish on this just keeps going and going, and maybe you've put the idea in my head tonight, but the transition between the nose and the palate and then the finish are just so seamless on this. It is just a journey, and it's a complete joy. I wouldn't necessarily call it an easy drinking whiskey. There's so much going on here that you want to you just keep thinking about what's hiding underneath and what's emerging. But I've just finished my glass now, and I immediately want more. I immediately wanted to go discover it again. So it's more-ish, if not easy drinking or something like that.
Yeah, easy drinking, it's a funny term because you think, oh, it must be really smooth, or it means something different to everyone. But sometimes when single casks, I don't classify for them. Me personally, I don't think of them as easy drinking because they're all so particular. They're like this big old bold person has just walked in, and you got to get to know them, and they're so up in your face, up in your grill. They're so unique, really, really particular characteristics, and that's the beauty of them. But you really need to spend time with a single cask and sit with it and just unpack it. There's just so much going on, and with these double casks that we put out, we try to create that complexity and put it all together. So it's a compliment. That there's a whole lot going on, that it's not easy drinking. Good.
Yeah. I think there's a difference. Sometimes they get lumped together, as you say, easy drinking and enjoyable drinking. I think because I get them mixed up. So if I call something easy drinking, it doesn't mean that it's simplistic. Or something like that. So I'm really enjoying this. So maybe I should start using the term enjoyable drinking rather than easy drinking.
Rather than intensive, you've got to really focus.
Yeah. I mean, 40% of it took 20 years to see the light of day. So we should spend longer than 15 minutes to appreciate that, I think.
It's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, Heather, I want to thank you so much for not only your efforts tonight, but your efforts throughout the not the year, but throughout all of your input into whiskey and into booze, and it's just been such a joy to chat with you, as it always is, because you learn something new every day, and again, trusting the Oak Barrel with stewardship of this release. As I mentioned, we've been talking for a long time about what we can potentially do and what makes sense, and telling this story, I think, was really important to actually sort of move forward and makes a lot of sense for us. You also managed to release another strain of the COVID variant, so I couldn't come down and harass you about, should it be at 45.8 or 45.7? So you've done well on that as well to keep me away.
Yeah, so it was all me.
Yeah.
Out of the bag.
Yeah. No, look, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we will. I promise we'll get you up here at some point when we're allowed to. Look,
I just changed the date, so I'm booked in, but I just don't know when it'll come to fruition. I look forward to it. It's been a pleasure, and absolutely worked together and entrusted this to very worthy hands. So it's an absolute pleasure collaborating with you, Scott.
Yeah, well, I look forward to meeting those worthy hands. Must be another staff member and not me, but look, it's a pleasure, and look, a fantastic way to finish the Whisky Forum this year. We would be gearing up for tomorrow, but instead we're sort of wrapping down, which is excellent. A tiny bit of housekeeping, because I can see people are already emailing me about what the go is with this release. We are going to wait until Heather decides that it is ready to go and is best looking in that settling period. So we will take the time and be guided by that. Because we've done this event and we've launched it, we are going to release a small amount on pre-sale tomorrow. I'm going to keep some back for when it lands, but also because I do want to do this in person as well and have a bit to play with and actually see people's reaction and see it in 6 months and a year's time and do that. So we're going to do a bit of that. So it's been an amazing evening. I want to say very quickly to some people that have helped out with Whisky Forum. It was a little bit different this year because last year we were rushing. Well, last year we knew Whisky Fair wasn't going to happen pretty early on, so we could plan it. This year we had planning like Whisky Fair was going to happen, and so it's been a little bit more of a rush. So to my girlfriend and the team here who donated their time to sit late back a few nights and pack boxes and shred cardboard to make more packing guff and all that sort of stuff, and to people like to Kathleen Davies who came to the rescue with some small boxes that we ran out of and glasses and that sort of stuff from the Nipper Carriage warehouse. That has been fantastic. So it's been awesome, and just personally from my point of view, we spoke about it on Wednesday night with Bill Lark and Tim Duckett, and the modern Australian whiskey industry is still very young. If it was kickstarted in the mid-90s with 92, 93 with Lark and 94 with Sullivans and those sort of distilleries, we don't have generations and generations of people who have worked in whiskey that can, make all these sort of flavors happen and create these things. But you're such a great example of the next generation of Australian whiskey, and not just for now, but in 10, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and then into the future as well, which is fascinating. So I think there was a lot of people who in the chat are just in awe if they haven't met or spoken to you before, just your knowledge and the way you approach things. And it is such a joy, and it's such a privilege to have us as part of our industry here in Australia. And thank God the borders are closed, so Scotland or America can't steal you at the moment, because we'd like to keep you here for a lot longer.
I got no intentions of. No, thank you, Scott. That's really kind. And yeah, if you haven't been down and visited, when we're allowed to, come and say good day. We've got a sick little cellar door and a great front of house team. We're in a humble Cambridge light industrial estate at the moment. Very romantic, but we're in a couple of years we'll be able to welcome you into a brand spanking new visitor centre and distillery down on the waterfront. So pop in your post-lockdown schedules to visit Sully's and say good day, and ask for Heather at the front with the cellar door. And if I'm in, I'll say good day.
And that is the hospitality that I've always encountered at Sullivans. It is an open house for something that is so premium and so special. It's amazing how down to earth you all are. So, look, thanks guys. It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. I couldn't think of a better way to wrap up Whisky Forum for this year. There's not much more to say apart from drink great whiskey and have fun. Really, without the people who've been part of this tasting as the consumers is watching, and people watching in the future, if you couldn't make it tonight, by buying these packs, by supporting Sullivans Cove, by supporting all Australian whiskey, by supporting independent bottlers, Oak Barrel and any other ones around the country. There's a multitude of great ones. This industry doesn't exist, and we don't get to do this. So thank you, everyone who's joined us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we will see you all hopefully in the flesh sometime soon.
Amen.